Day 17 of the Ukraine war and that familiar arc of territory occupied by Russian forces. And I'm joined by Air Marshal Edward Stringer, former Director of Operations at the Ministry of Defence. And Ed, we're hearing now reports from Ukrainian authorities that Mariupol, down in the southeast there, the outskirts, have been occupied by the Russian forces. Now, why is that such a significant city for the Russians?
No surprises here. The surprise is that they haven't taken it already. Mariupol is the second port on the Black Sea. It's here in the Sea of Azov, which the Russians have long wanted to claim as a Russian lake, if you like. And Mariupol has been a thorn in the side for a while. It's also part of that land bridge connecting Russia through the Donbass all the way down to Crimea. And it might be an indicator of just how difficult Russians are finding things, that it's taken this long to really try and take a city which they must have thought they would get much earlier. Let's
take a look at northern Ukraine then, because there have been significant movements around the capital, Kyiv. Just talk us through what's been happening.
Well, we know about what's happened there to the northwest of Kyiv, because that was a 40-mile convoy that got itself stuck last week. And then we saw this other line of advance heading west to Kyiv from the east, a second line of communication, a second logistic train that has to be maintained.
But it's a long supply chain that now is required to keep all those forces if they are trying to surround Kyiv.
Yes, absolutely. And what we see, and we'll look in a minute at the close-up map, is this looks like an attempt to invest Kyiv, to put a cordon around it. But it's another very long line of communication. We're getting into the spring. It's a muddy area, narrow roads, forested, ambush country. This is yet another logistic challenge for the Russians.
Well, as you say, let's take a look at a closer map of Kyiv, etc., etc. Those gateway towns, Brovary in the east there, that has come under a lot of pressure from Russian forces, and also those towns up in the northwest too, clearly coming under a lot of fire from the Russians.
Yes, and what you see, these are the tips, if you like, of those two thrusts that we saw on the previous map, coming down from the north, coming in from the east. And so, yes, what you're now seeing are firefights in both of those areas. But what we assume this is the start of is an attempt to encircle Kyiv. But Kyiv is a big city. That encirclement is a 50-mile perimeter. That is a huge number of troops that you've got to resupply once you've put them in place, if you can.
And we can see from the latest satellite imagery evidence of what is happening on the ground. This is Moshun, which is one of those towns in the northwest there. It's a residential area.
Yes, and we haven't had a chance to pick through all in detail, but you don't have to look too closely to see here that some of these dwellings have been destroyed. This is a residential area. It doesn't look to me like it's a fortified position, and yet Russian shelling has clearly leveled bits of it. Let's be honest, this is terrorism on the civilian population.
And we have got evidence in the next image of Russian artillery being fired. Now, Maxar, that took these satellite images, says that those are being fired to the southeast towards a residential area.
Yes, so we can't see exactly what the artillery pieces are here, but let's assume typically medium-sized piece, a D30, would have a range of about 10 miles, 16 kilometres, which would take it from there almost into the centre of Kyiv, which means all the residential areas from here to the centre of Kyiv are now in range of these weapons.
And for civilians, if we have a look at the next image, you can see the impact on all those, that Russian firepower massing on the very edge of the city. That's gridlock, civilians fleeing the city.
Yes, and this is what happens when you terrorise the civilian population. And back to what we've been discussing before, this seems to me indicative of Plan B. The Russians aiming to circle Kyiv, aiming to terrorise the population, aiming to put pressure on Zelensky to force some form of compromise.
Well, let's pull back and look at the whole map of Ukraine then, because around the country now, we know there have been reports from the Ukrainian authorities of 3 senior Russian generals have been killed in the conflict so far. What's the significance of that?
Major generals, 2-star generals, are not supposed to be anywhere near the front line. That they are implies they've gone to the front line to sort out major problems, and that they're just not making the progress that they expected to, and therefore they're being picked off. the Russian claim that they've lost about 500 people when you've lost 3 major generals just cannot be credible. It tells me that the Russian military plan is not going according to plan.
Air Marshal Edward Stringer, thank you very much. So clearly you heard from Ed there that the Russian forces are being stretched and perhaps taking risks with their senior personnel. It's the situation they're being forced into.